And it's disappointing to hear the Conservative members from the Atlantic continue to stand up and oppose good, clean jobs in Nova Scotia. But over the past 2 years, we've seen hurricanes that caused billions of damage, fires in that member's riding that cost millions of damage. We've seen floods that have taken people's lives, and yet that member seems to say, there's nothing to see here. I have 2 questions for this member. First of all, does he agree with the provincial premier of Nova Scotia that said climate change is real, it's obvious, or will that member continue to bury his sand in the sand and say how many more state of emergencies do we need in Nova Scotia before that member agrees that climate change is real and it's time to act?
Honorable député de South Shore, St. Margaret's.
It's a little ironic coming from this member who's voted 24 times to increase the cost of everything on all of his constituents. Now, on the issue of storms, we've had storms every decade, multiple storms every decade since 1700s. He should look up the history. And yes, I had fires that were started, man-made fires that were started in my riding. That wasn't started by climate change, that was started by individuals. Perhaps he would like to explain to me why he disagrees with his colleague from Avalon and from the commitment of the Minister of Fisheries to the member that said she should correct the problems to make sure it's right. Will he stand up and agree with his Minister of Finance and the member for Avalon that the carbon tax needs to be fixed? It's hurting people in Atlantic Canada.
Good question.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's is a very kind person because as the member from Sydney, Victoria stands in this House and lectures Conservatives on our record, I wouldn't even dignify that with an answer or even acknowledge until he stands in this House and actually apologizes for his past comments towards Indigenous women, which I find offensive, and I think many Canadians find offensive, and I still would like to hear an apology in this House from that member from Sydney, Victoria. But through you, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's. You know, in British Columbia, we've had a carbon tax for over a decade. Right. Yet, we've seen increasing wildfires. We've seen incredible drought situations. Increased emissions, greenhouse gases have not gone down. How high does the carbon tax have to be before we see the end to these climate events that we're seeing and stop punishing Canadians?
L'honorable député a 1 minute pour répondre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Great question. The member for Sydney, Victoria, and his past comments speak for themselves in his attitude towards women. The fact that it's tolerated and he's rewarded with a parliamentary secretary spot is just a mystery to me. But that aside, in terms of how high can it go, I don't think there's any limit to how high the Liberals can put a tax, especially when they're ineffective. Their plan, I believe, is to go to at least $270 a ton. That means in the short term, at least 61 cents a litre on gasoline. And in my riding, and I know in the honourable member's riding, I don't have public transit. My constituents don't have public transit. They have to drive everywhere. They have to drive to grocery stores. They have to drive their kids to school. They have to drive to hockey games. They have to drive to see their family and parents. And it's becoming increasingly unaffordable caused by a tax that has no impact on the actual reduction of climate emissions.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Repentigny.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to see you in the chair. In his speech, my colleague spoke about illness and cancer, and I'd like to come back to that. Because what does pollution lead to? What does it lead to? Yes, more cancer, more cardiovascular illnesses, more respiratory illnesses, and it also leads to kidney diseases. There's malnutrition due to the decrease in agricultural yields or problems caused by pests. So why does the official opposition not seem to want to fight pollution more?
Oh, we believe pollution should be fought. We believe it's through technology, not through taxes that don't work. The carbon tax has had zero impact in this country on the rate of carbon emissions. In fact, every year of this government, except for when they shut the entire economy down during COVID, carbon emissions have gone up. And they're so lack of knowledge with regard to what's going on in the world. If we were at net zero today, and China would make that up in 56 days with their plan on expansion of coal plants. Yet they oppose us getting liquefied natural gas to China so that the real emissions, a third of the world's emissions, could actually be reduced. I'd like to ask the members opposite why they hate reducing the coal production of China so much.
Questions et commentaires de façon virtuelle, l'honorable député d'Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague from South Shore, St. Margaret. You know, last Thursday we were in the House and he brought up the fact that the wildfires in Canada were man-made and that storms have been hitting his region for hundreds of years. And I was shocked. And the next day I actually was in Montreal at a climate march with young people asking for real action on climate change in this country. The member just doubled down on that in his response to my Liberal colleague. I have a serious question for him. Does he actually believe that climate change is real? Does he actually stand in this House and claim that climate change is not an actual fact in the hurricanes hitting his community, in the wildfires ravaging our communities, and the massive costs that are associated with that? Does he believe in climate change? Does he think it's real?
L'honorable député.
Well, it's another example of a Liberal-NDP coalition member who doesn't listen to constituents, doesn't listen to what anyone in this House says. We have said many times, I have said, as has our leader, as has every member, of course climate change is real, but the tax doesn't do anything to change that. And leave it to a member of that costly coalition to not actually hear what I said, which was the fires in my riding were started by individuals. They were not started by climate change. But she forgets those facts because they're inconvenient for her.
Questions et commentaires de façon virtuelle encore une fois, l'honorable député de Saanich Gulf Island.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, and to my honourable colleague from South Shore St. Margaret. Let's just distinguish on the last point that was being made between who started a fire, whether it was a lightning strike or somebody who threw a cigarette butt out a window, and the fuel load in place that causes the wildfires. He knows perfectly well, because we've talked about this, we share many things, including a history in Nova Scotia, that the month of May in Nova Scotia is historically wet and cold. You couldn't start a forest fire there if you tried for many, many years, most years. But the year after year, recently, very recently, because of climate change and global warming, the month of May in Nova Scotia has been hot and dry. And this year, for the first time, we had extensive wildfires because of climate change, regardless of who lit the match that hit the fuel load that was hot and dry and ready to catch fire because of climate change. To the earlier points in the bill we're debating right now, C-49, I'm sure he'll recall that it was our mutual friend, the late Pat Carney, who negotiated the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board Act and the Canada-Newfoundland-Labrador Act. The difference between tidal power and offshore wind is that offshore wind is a fully developed technology and ready to implement. We're still working to try to develop tidal power, and it is not yet fully formed, and it has not yet solved the threats to fisheries.
L'honorable député de Saint Shore, St. Margaret's.
Thank the member for Saanich Gulf Islands and our mutual friend, the late, the Honourable Pat Carney. Yes, she did negotiate those deals, and from our perspective, I appreciate the member thinks that this was an unusual year. Yes, this was an El Nino year in North America, where we got less rain in the spring than we did last year or the year before. I expect when we don't have an El Nino year again, that will change. And with regard to the issue of where wind power goes and generation, of course we believe in tidal power and wind power. That's why I spoke for a great deal of my speech about the only project that's ever worked, the tidal power by sustainable marine energy, that this government shut down, that actually returned without damage, continued to return power to the Nova Scotia power grid and get paid for, yet they used it as an excuse to shut it down. DFO had given 4 approvals, wouldn't give the 5th. And that approach to shutting down all energy projects, whether it be oil and gas or on the renewable side of things, is the problem with this bill, because it puts in place those terrible provisions of the IAA and the Bill C-69 into this process.
Exactly.